The cold sting of the needle was still in my arm when my own son messaged, "Dad says you're on your own now." Still, I kept my eyes on the machine, watching it pull what little I had left. As the antiseptic hit my nose, I thought of the living room they cleared me out of like old furniture. While the nurse handed me $40, I folded it slowly, like the last bit of dignity they hadn't stolen. The same plasma they called desperate sold for millions to a biotech firm days later. That's when I bought my silence, with a contract that cut them out forever. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Helen sat in the old armchair by the window, the one Tom had given her for Christmas 5 years ago. It creaked every time she shifted her weight, a reminder of the quiet years she'd spent with Charles before his passing. The sunlight filtered in, soft and weak, as if the house itself knew something was about to change. Her hands, stiff from age and stress, gripped the edge of the armrest. She'd prepared for this moment, rehearsed it 1,000 times in her head, but now that it was here, the words caught in her throat. Tom and Catherine sat across from her, the two of them close together, like they always were, always in sync. It made the moment feel even more isolating, the empty space between Helen and them growing wider by the second. She took a slow breath, her eyes briefly scanning the room before meeting Tom's gaze. "I've lost everything," she began, her voice steady, though every muscle in her body was tight. "The investments failed. I'm bankrupt." The words hung in the air, as heavy and final as the closing of a door. For a long moment, neither Tom nor Catherine spoke. The silence in the room seemed to stretch, thickening with unspoken thoughts. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming nervously on his knee. Catherine's eyes narrowed, lips pressing together in something between disbelief and disdain. "This is so embarrassing," Catherine said, the words sharp and cold. She didn't meet Helen's gaze, instead looking down at her perfectly manicured nails, a habit Helen had come to despise. "How could you let this happen? You were always so careful. You were supposed to be secure, Mom." Helen's chest tightened. The sting of Catherine's words hit harder than she expected, sharper than she'd ever imagined. Catherine wasn't just disappointed, she was repulsed. As if Helen's misfortune was something to be ashamed of, something beneath them. Helen swallowed, trying to keep her voice even. "I didn't expect this," she replied, her eyes flicking toward Tom, hoping for something, anything, a glimmer of understanding. "But the market, Charles and I—" She trailed off, the words dying in her mouth. What was the point? Catherine wasn't listening. Neither was Tom. Tom was avoiding her eyes, staring at the floor, at the coffee table, anywhere but at her. His jaw was clenched, his face tight with a mixture of frustration and discomfort. The silence grew unbearable, thick and suffocating. She had hoped, no, needed, him to say something. Anything. But all he managed was a quiet, almost apologetic murmur. "I don't know what to say, Mom," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He shifted again in his seat, as if the very presence of his mother's failure was something he could not handle. His discomfort was palpable, radiating between them like a cold fog. Helen's stomach twisted. She'd always known Tom wasn't the emotional type. But this was different. She had expected some kind of reaction, even if it was anger or disbelief. But this was worse. This was indifference, a subtle form of rejection. She blinked back the tears threatening to fall, pressing her lips together so tightly that the pain in her chest seemed to pierce deeper. She had spent years putting everything she had into being strong for them. For Tom, for Charles, for the family. And now? Now, when she needed them most, it was as if they were already gone. Catherine crossed her arms, a clear barrier between them, her posture rigid. I think we need to figure out where you're going to stay, she said, her tone cutting. All business now. You can't stay here, Helen. We're already stretched thin. Helen's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. The words were brutal in their simplicity, but it was the underlying truth behind them that hurt the most. There was no room for her in their lives anymore, not even in the space she had once helped create. Tom didn't say anything, but his silence was agreement. She nodded, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't going to beg. She wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. Her pride, what little of it was left, held her still, even as the sting of betrayal clawed at her chest. Helen stood slowly, her knees creaking as she pushed herself upright. She reached for her purse, the leather worn and familiar in her hands. I'll figure it out, she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. I always do. Tom and Catherine didn't reply, didn't offer to help. It was like she had already been written out of their story. She walked to the door without another word, not trusting herself to speak again. As she stepped out into the hallway, her heart sank. This wasn't just a loss of money. This was the loss of everything. And there was no one left to catch her fall. Helen's new apartment was smaller than she had imagined, a tiny one-bedroom tucked away in the corner of an aging building on the edge of Nashville's quieter streets. The walls were a dull beige, and the kitchen, though functional, barely had enough space for a coffee maker and a microwave. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the faint smell of old carpet lingered in the air. It felt cold, even with the heat running. She placed her purse on the counter, staring at the empty room. This was it. This was the beginning of whatever came next. The silence was deafening. No Tom. No Catherine. No family. Not even the echoes of their footsteps through the house she had once called home. It was just her now, alone in this small space that felt more like a holding cell than a home. The idea of starting over, of trying to find a way to piece her life back together, seemed both laughable and heartbreaking. She had been married to Charles for 35 years, spent all her energy keeping their lives together. And now, in the wake of his death and her financial collapse, it was as if she had nothing to build on. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up, already knowing who it was before she even looked at the screen. Catherine's name stared back at her. Helen sighed, pressed her thumb to the screen, and put the phone to her ear. Hello? You're on your own now. Catherine's voice came through, cool and distant. Don't expect us to help. You made this mess yourself. Helen felt the familiar ache of betrayal, but she swallowed it down. She had no more tears left to cry. I understand, she said softly, her voice thin but resolute. Goodbye, Catherine. The call ended before Catherine could say anything else. Helen put the phone down slowly, a dull weight settling in her chest. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the words or the fact that she'd known deep down that this was the way it would go. No help, no sympathy, just a cold, final push into the unknown. With a long breath, Helen stood and moved to the window. Outside, the sky was gray, thick with clouds, as if the world was mourning with her. It was almost fitting. There was no bright light at the end of this tunnel. No warmth. Just cold, hard reality. But she couldn't stay here. She couldn't let herself sink any deeper into despair. Not when she still had something left. Her strength. Even if it didn't feel like much. After a moment, she turned away from the window and grabbed her coat. It was time to get out. Time to do something. Anything. Helen had heard about plasma donation centers before, but never thought much of it. She'd never needed to. Now, though, with every penny counting, she wasn't in a position to be picky. She needed to do something, anything, to bring in a little money. The center was a short drive away, a small, nondescript building on the edge of a strip mall. As she walked in, The sterile scent of antiseptic hit her, mingling with the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. The receptionist at the front desk smiled briefly as Helen approached. "I'm here to donate," she said, her voice steady. The receptionist nodded and handed her a form to fill out. Helen sat down, trying to keep her hands from shaking as she filled in the details. The questions were simple enough: name, address, health history, but she had to pause when it asked about her last blood donation. It had been years. Years since she'd last needed to donate for a cause. She'd always been healthy. But now, in the wake of everything that had happened, even this felt like a reminder of the life she'd once had. When it was her turn, she was led into a small room with a reclining chair. The nurse, a young woman named Sarah, smiled as she adjusted the IV needle. "First time?" Sarah asked gently, her voice soft, almost like she understood the uncertainty Helen was feeling. Helen nodded. "Yes. I just need to make a little extra money." Sarah's smile faded and she studied Helen's arm for a moment before beginning the procedure. "Well, you're in luck," Sarah said, glancing up at her with a touch of curiosity. "You've got excellent veins and your plasma is really high quality. It's rare, you know." Helen blinked. "Really?" Sarah nodded. "Yep. In fact, you could probably make a lot more than just the standard payment. Some people would pay for plasma like yours." Helen's heart skipped. She hadn't expected to hear that. "How much more?" she asked, her voice steady but eager. "Well, I'm not in charge of those decisions," Sarah replied, working with a practiced precision as she connected the plasma bag to the needle. "But from what I know, rare plasma can be worth quite a bit. More than just a few dollars." Helen lay back in the chair, trying to process what Sarah had said. Rare plasma. She closed her eyes, focusing on the soft beeping of the machines, trying to imagine a world where she could sell this valuable plasma, where it could make her life a little easier. It was a long shot, but it was something. She opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling. Maybe this was the beginning of something. Maybe there was hope after all. As Sarah finished the procedure and the blood began to flow, Helen allowed herself one small, fleeting thought. Maybe she wasn't as broken as she had thought. But as the machine hummed, the future still felt uncertain. What if this wasn't the way out? What if it was just another empty hope, like the failed investments, like everything else? Helen didn't know. But she did know one thing. She was going to try. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Helen sat in the sterile waiting room of the plasma center, a dull hum of machines filling the quiet space. The soft clink of glass bottles and the faint murmur of voices from the back reminded her of how small her world had become. She tried to push away the feeling of being a mere cog in a system she barely understood. Just another person in line, waiting for their turn, offering up whatever was left of them. A soft tap on her shoulder snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned to see a man in a white lab coat standing there, his sharp features softening as he smiled at her. He was tall, with graying hair at the temples, and his eyes held a look of quiet authority, the kind that commanded attention without needing to raise his voice. "You're Mrs. Brooks, correct?" he asked, his tone professional but warm. Helen nodded, still a little disoriented from the procedure, and offered a hesitant smile. "Yes, I am. How can I help you?" "My name is Dr. Victor Campbell," he said, extending his hand. "I'm a plasma research specialist. I wanted to talk to you about something important." Helen took his hand, her grip firm, but her curiosity growing. "What's this about?" Dr. Campbell gestured for her to follow him into a small private office at the back of the center. She glanced around before stepping inside, wondering what this was all about. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and he motioned for her to sit at the small round table. "I've been reviewing your donation," he began, his voice measured but urgent. "And I need to tell you something that might surprise you. Your plasma. It's incredibly rare. In fact, it's one of the highest quality samples we've seen in years. Helen blinked, trying to process his words. Rare? I don't understand. It's just plasma, isn't it? He nodded, folding his hands in front of him. In a way, yes, but there are different types, and certain qualities are more valuable for medical research, particularly in immunology and genetic research. What you've got is extremely valuable, Mrs. Brooks. It's exceptional. She sat back, her mind racing. The $40 she had been paid for her donation now seemed like a drop in the ocean compared to what Dr. Campbell was hinting at. So, what does that mean for me? Dr. Campbell leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning her face as though he was searching for a reaction. It means that we'd like to offer you compensation for regular donations, a payment far beyond what you received today. This could be a significant income stream for you, one that could make a real difference in your financial situation. Helen's chest tightened. The weight of what he was suggesting settled over her like a heavy fog. Her thoughts were all over the place. She had just barely started to crawl out from under the wreckage of her life, and now, here was a chance to make money. Real money. By donating her plasma. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? Are you saying I could make more than just the $40? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. Dr. Campbell smiled faintly as if this was exactly what he had hoped she would ask. Much more. We can discuss the exact terms, but rest assured it will be worth your while. And you'll be helping advance cutting-edge research in the process. It's a win-win, Mrs. Brooks. Helen sat there, her mind spinning. On one hand, this felt like the break she had been desperately searching for. On the other, it seemed too easy, too simple. Could she really agree to something like this? Would it be safe? Would it be worth it? But she didn't have time to hesitate. Her bank account was empty, her bills were piling up, and she was still a stranger in her own life, just trying to keep moving forward. She had nothing left to lose, except perhaps a little more of her dignity. She exhaled slowly, meeting Dr. Campbell's gaze with a new resolve. All right, she said, her voice firm despite the swirling uncertainty. I'll do it. I need the money. He nodded, his expression turning serious. We'll arrange the details. You'll start receiving regular payments, and you'll be compensated handsomely for your donations. It's a deal then. Helen felt the knot in her stomach loosen a fraction, but the unease remained. This was no ordinary choice. It felt as if she were stepping into a world she hadn't planned on, a world that could either lift her from the depths of her despair or swallow her whole. As she left the center that day, a check for her next donation already in her purse, Helen couldn't shake the sense that something was shifting. The money would help, but at what cost? She would be in control. At least, that's what she told herself. But she couldn't ignore the nagging question. Was she really making the choice? Or was this just another step into a bigger, darker game? Back in her apartment, the familiar silence greeted her once more, but this time, she wasn't alone. There was something new in the air, a tension, a flicker of possibility, and just as quickly a feeling of fear, of uncertainty. But there was no turning back now. The next donation loomed ahead, and with it, the weight of what she had agreed to. Whatever it was that lay waiting in the shadows of Dr. Campbell's offer. But she wasn't going to let fear stop her. Not now. Not when this might finally be the chance to rebuild what had been broken. And yet, as the days passed and the payments started to arrive, Helen couldn't shake the sense that she had paid more than she realized, and not just in plasma. Helen sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, staring at the check in front of her. It was larger than she'd ever imagined. Far more than the small, meager payments she'd gotten from her initial plasma donations. Her fingers trembled slightly as she ran them over the numbers, a knot of disbelief tightening in her chest. The payment was enough to cover her rent, her bills, even some left over for groceries and basic necessities. She hadn't felt this secure in months. She had spent the past week in a daze, going through the motions of her daily routine, donating plasma every few days, and letting the money accumulate. But now, holding this check, she understood the gravity of what Dr. Campbell had offered. She wasn't just scraping by anymore, she was in control. The past few days had felt like a whirlwind of confusion and uncertainty, but this felt like a real lifeline. Helen leaned back in her chair, glancing out the window. The city was waking up, the streets below bustling with life. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She felt grounded. There was a sense of calm that had eluded her since the financial collapse, a quiet realization that, for once, things might just be getting better. But as the warmth of that thought settled in, something else crept into her mind. She hadn't told anyone about the money. Tom and Catherine had no idea about the plasma donations or how much she'd been earning. It felt like a secret she had to keep hidden from them, as if revealing it would open the door to judgment, to the same dismissive coldness they'd shown when she first told them about her bankruptcy. Her hands curled around the check, a mixture of pride and shame rushing through her. She wasn't sure which one was stronger. That afternoon, Helen sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of research papers. She had started looking into plasma donations more seriously after receiving the first check. As much as she felt relieved, she had to understand more about what she was getting involved in. The more she read, the clearer it became that she was sitting on something valuable, something that went far beyond just making ends meet. Plasma, particularly rare types, was in high demand. The kinds of plasma that Dr. Campbell was interested in were used in cutting-edge research, some of it linked to diseases that had long been without a cure. It was a strange feeling, knowing her blood was part of something so significant, something that could save lives. She was more than just a donor now. She was a commodity, and the truth of it settled uncomfortably on her. She had power. Power that, until now, she had never thought she'd possess again. The phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Tom. She hesitated for a moment, fingers hovering over the screen. He hadn't reached out much since she'd left the house, and when he did, it was always in the same clinical, distant way. But she answered. "Mom?" Tom's voice was faintly unsure, like he didn't quite know what to say. "Just checking in. How are you doing?" Helen's chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm fine, Tom. Everything's manageable." She didn't want to explain further. She couldn't. There was something in the way he asked that made her wary, made her feel like he was only doing this out of obligation. The last thing she needed now was for him to start questioning her decisions. "Well, if you need anything, Catherine and I can help out. I mean, we can't just leave you to figure everything out on your own," Tom said. The offer sounded hollow, a polite formality rather than genuine concern. "I'll manage," Helen replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'm doing better than you think." There was a brief silence before Tom responded. "Well, if you're sure." His voice was distant again, and the conversation ended awkwardly. Helen stared at the phone for a moment, her heart pounding. She had kept the money, the relief, the new stability from him, not because she wanted to hurt him, but because she knew the moment she told him, it would open a door she wasn't ready to walk through. Catherine would be there too, probably with an expression of disbelief or judgment. They wouldn't understand. Later that night, after dinner, Helen sat down at the small desk in her bedroom, the check still lying in front of her. It was time to think about her future, her next step. The plasma money was already making a difference, but she knew she couldn't rely on it forever. What if, at some point, they found someone with better plasma? Or what if Dr. Campbell's research took a turn, and her donations weren't needed anymore. She had to make sure she was ready, make sure she had something to fall back on. She had always been careful with money, even when she'd had it. She hadn't been reckless, and that carefulness had paid off over the years. She'd made some good investments before, though the ones that had failed were more recent. But the truth was, she didn't want to risk everything again. The plasma money was a gift, but she had to think about her future in a broader way. Helen opened her laptop and started looking into small, manageable investments. Maybe something in stocks. Nothing too risky, but enough to keep the money growing. It felt like a gamble, but it also felt like a choice she hadn't had in years. She made a few notes, bookmarked a couple of websites, and sat back, looking at the papers on her desk. The weight of her decisions pressed on her, but for the first time in a long time, Helen didn't feel paralyzed. She felt like she was taking control again. As she turned off the computer and went to bed, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. And as she lay in the quiet of her apartment, she realized that even in her solitude, she wasn't entirely alone. She had herself. And that, for now, was enough. But as the days passed, and her income began to rise, so did the questions. Helen started to wonder, how long would it take before Dr. Campbell asked for more than just her plasma? And what would she do when he did? The air was cooler now, the fading light of dusk casting soft shadows over Helen's small apartment. She sat at her kitchen table, a pen in hand, eyes scanning the contract Dr. Campbell had sent her. It was an official document, legal jargon that felt as dense and heavy as the decision she was about to make. Her mind buzzed with the reality of it. A contract for regular plasma donations, with a promise of an even larger sum than she'd ever imagined. The numbers were staggering. And yet, despite the excitement it should have brought, Helen hesitated. It wasn't just the money that made her pause. It was what this contract represented. A deeper tie to something she hadn't fully understood, something she wasn't sure she wanted to be a part of. But as her fingers traced the lines of the agreement, she felt a shift inside her. This could be the chance I've been waiting for. I could actually have something to show for the mess I've been through. Her eyes flicked toward the window, where the evening lights of the city twinkled in the distance. The thought of building something, a future, even if it wasn't what she had planned, felt freeing. A sense of stability, like a long-lost friend, crept back into her life. The moment she signed the contract, the floodgates opened. The payments increased, and Helen's once skeletal bank account began to swell. It wasn't just about paying the rent anymore, it was about breathing again. She could finally start planning for her future. Not just surviving, but thriving. A few days later, she found herself at a small real estate office, looking at a modest property on the outskirts of Nashville. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom house on a quiet street, but it had potential. The small backyard, the old oak tree by the fence, the space to breathe. It felt like the beginning of something. She walked through the house slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms, imagining what it could be. A place to call her own, a place to grow. She made the decision right then. She put in an offer, and it was accepted. The down payment was steep, but it was nothing she couldn't handle now. For the first time in years, she didn't have to stretch the truth or tell herself lies about what she could afford. She had enough. Weeks passed, and Helen settled into a new rhythm. Her days began to take on a new structure. In the mornings, she visited the plasma center, the sterile machines becoming a familiar hum in the background of her life. In the afternoons, she spent hours researching investment opportunities, looking for ways to put her growing wealth to good use. She wasn't in a hurry. She was careful now. Every step forward was calculated, deliberate. Helen also began making plans for her newfound wealth. Not just for herself, but for the future of others. She had never been one to boast, and the idea of public recognition felt foreign to her. But the thought of quietly giving back, without anyone knowing, gave her peace. One evening, after signing the final papers for her new house, she made an anonymous donation to a charity that supported widows and elderly women who had lost their financial stability. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a difference in someone's life. A small gesture, a way to pass on the quiet dignity she had fought so hard to maintain. The feeling that came with it wasn't fleeting, like some small victory over her past. It was grounding, like she had finally planted roots in a world she hadn't thought she could stand in. Still, despite all the changes, there was one constant: Tom and Catherine. They were still distant, still hovering on the periphery of her life like shadows she couldn't shake. She had made sure to keep the new house and the growing sum of money she was earning a secret. The last thing she wanted was to give them any reason to judge or question her. She wasn't ready to face their reactions. Not when she had worked so hard to reclaim even the smallest bit of control over her life. One day, Tom called again. "Mom, I was thinking, maybe you could come over for dinner this weekend. We're having some family over," he said, his voice polite but cool. Helen's hand tightened around the phone, a flicker of old guilt rising in her chest. "I'll think about it," she said, trying to keep her voice even. She wasn't ready to confront them, not yet. There was a long pause before Tom replied. "Well, if you need anything, money, help with the house, just let us know." Helen's chest tightened. The words were wrapped in a layer of politeness, but there was a sting there too. Why didn't he understand? She had worked so hard to rebuild, to get back on her feet without relying on anyone. But here they were again, offering their version of help. She forced a smile, even though he couldn't see it. "I'm doing fine, Tom. Really. You don't need to worry about me." After the call ended, Helen sat still for a long time, staring at the empty space in front of her. She had built this life on her own terms, but the distance between her and her son felt wider than ever. Tom and Catherine would never understand how far she had come, not just in wealth, but in strength. They would never see the quiet power she had discovered in herself. She wasn't their charity case anymore. She had rebuilt her life piece by piece. And now she was the one who had something to give, not just financially, but in spirit. And that was her real legacy. Not the house, not the money, but the fact that she had done it herself. She had built something that no one could take away. But even as Helen sat there, her thoughts swirling with plans for the future, a deeper unease began to creep in. She knew that sooner or later the truth would surface. And when it did, she wasn't sure what would happen next. Would they resent her? Would they want a share of her success? But for now, Helen was at peace. For the first time in years, she had a sense of ownership over her life, and that was enough. As she turned off the lights and closed the door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead. Helen had always known that silence was a double-edged sword. It gave her peace, but also bred unease. It was that same quiet that had allowed her to rebuild her life without interference. But now, in the weeks since her last conversation with Tom, the silence had grown unbearable. The distance between her and her son, between her and Catherine, was palpable. Even her small victories, her newfound stability, felt like secrets she couldn't share. It was a Sunday morning when Catherine finally confronted her. Helen had just returned from her routine donation, the usual hum of the plasma machine still echoing in her mind. She was sipping her coffee at the kitchen table, lost in thought, when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, Catherine stood there, her posture rigid, her face taut with frustration. "I need to talk to you," Catherine said, her voice colder than Helen had ever heard it. Helen stepped aside, surprised but not entirely unprepared. She had known this moment was coming, the moment when Catherine could no longer hold her anger at bay. Catherine walked past her into the apartment, pacing a few steps before turning to face her. "I can't believe you've been keeping this from us," she said, her voice sharp. "The money you've been making, the house. You've hid all of it. You didn't think we'd want to know?" Helen swallowed, trying to keep her composure. "I didn't want to burden you with it," she said quietly. "I knew how you felt about my financial situation before. I didn't want things to change." "Burden us?" Catherine's voice rose, her frustration spilling over. "You think that's what this is about? This isn't just about money, Helen. It's about you lying to us, about shutting us out, about thinking you had to do everything on your own, like we're the enemy." Helen took a deep breath, the sting of Catherine's words cutting deeper than she cared to admit. She had expected anger, but the accusation of selfishness hit harder than she could have prepared for. "I didn't lie to you, Catherine. I just—" Helen's voice faltered, but she steadied herself. "I wanted to do this on my own, to prove to myself that I could." She paused, her gaze falling to the floor, then meeting Catherine's eyes again. "I didn't want to ask for help. Not this time." Catherine crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "You think this was the right way? Keeping it a secret? We're your family, Helen. We should have known. And now we find out like this?" The accusation burned. Helen's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm, to not let the bitterness rise. She understood Catherine's anger even if it didn't make sense to her. "I didn't keep it from you to hurt you," Helen replied, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "I just didn't want to bring it up. I didn't want you to see me as someone who's different. Someone who's better." Catherine scoffed, her lips curling in disdain. "You're unbelievable. You've changed, and not in a good way. You act like you're some kind of hero now, like you've done everything on your own. But the truth is, you've left us behind, and we've had to watch you grow into someone who doesn't need us." Helen's heart twisted at the words. She hadn't meant to leave them behind. She hadn't meant to build a wall between them, but her decision to keep things to herself had done exactly that. "Maybe I needed to do this on my own," Helen said, her voice low but resolute. "Maybe I needed to rebuild myself without anyone's judgment or expectation. I didn't want to be the person you saw when you looked at me. I wanted to be someone else." There was a silence that settled between them, heavy and thick. Before Catherine spoke again, her voice softer, but still tinged with anger. "You should have asked for help. We're family. We could have supported you. But instead, you shut us out." Tom's voice came from the doorway then, barely a whisper, but cutting through the tension like a knife. "Helen's right. She didn't want our pity. But maybe you're right, Mom. Maybe she should have asked." Helen turned to look at Tom, standing awkwardly in the doorway, arms crossed. His face was a mask, emotionless, distant. He wasn't fully on her side, but he wasn't completely against her either. "I don't need pity," Helen said firmly, turning back to face Catherine. "I never wanted pity. I needed my own strength. And I've found it." Catherine's expression hardened, but Helen could see the doubt in her eyes, the subtle shift from anger to uncertainty. She hadn't expected to change her mind, but she could see Catherine starting to see things differently. Maybe not all at once, but it was a start. Tom, after a long pause, spoke again, his voice quieter now. "You should have at least told us, Mom. We're family. You could have trusted us more." Helen felt the familiar pang of guilt, but she pushed it down. She wouldn't apologize for this, for her independence, for her strength. She had built this new life on her own, and she wouldn't let them tear it down. "I don't owe you an apology, Tom. Or you, Catherine. I've earned this. I've fought for it." The words hung in the air, hanging between them like a tense wire, unspoken and sharp. Neither Tom nor Catherine said anything after that. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions and a rift that couldn't be mended so easily. After a long pause, Helen turned toward the kitchen, her heart still heavy but resolute. "I'm not going to apologize for taking control of my life. If you can't accept that, then that's on you." With that, she walked out of the room, the weight of the conversation settling deep inside her. She had made her choice. And now, no matter what, she would continue to build her future, on her own terms. As the door closed behind her, she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. And though she was shaken, she wasn't going to let them take what she had fought so hard to build. Her independence was her victory, and it was one she wouldn't let anyone steal. Helen sat at her kitchen table, the quiet weight of the papers in front of her a stark contrast to the storm brewing outside. The sky had darkened, and the first heavy drops of rain pattered against the window, a constant reminder of the storm that was now shaking her life from the inside out. She ran a finger over the legal documents laid out before her, pages from her lawyer, Michael, detailing the lawsuit filed by Tom and Catherine. They wanted her to return the money she'd earned from her plasma donations. "It's my money," Helen thought bitterly. "They don't get to decide how I use it." The phone rang, breaking her concentration. She hesitated before answering, already knowing who it was. "Mom." Tom's voice was cold, distant. "I need to talk to you about the money. It's wrong, you know. You can't just keep it all to yourself. You owe it to us. To the family." Helen's chest tightened. "No, Tom. I don't owe you anything." "You think you can just walk away with that much money and not share it? You're being selfish." He shot back, his tone accusing. "You should have told us. We could have helped. But instead, you just took." Helen fought the frustration rising inside her, the familiar pang of rejection twisting in her stomach. "I didn't take anything, Tom. It's mine. I earned it." There was silence on the other end for a moment before he finally spoke again, his voice low but insistent. "I want you to give it back. All of it." "I'm not going to do that," she said, her voice firm. "This is my victory, Tom. You don't get to take it from me." He didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his words were laced with bitterness. "You'll regret this, Mom. Just wait." The call ended abruptly, and Helen dropped the phone onto the table. She didn't regret anything. She had worked for this, earned it, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her, especially not from her own son. The days that followed were filled with more pressure than Helen had expected. Her phone rang constantly, Catherine's voice creeping into her thoughts like an unwelcome shadow. Rumors spread quickly through the family circle. Helen could hear the whispers, the subtle shifts in tone when people spoke to her, if they spoke to her at all. Catherine had begun telling their friends about Helen's newfound wealth, painting her as someone who was hoarding money, someone who had turned her back on them. Helen tried to ignore the rumors, but they seeped into her consciousness, the harsh judgments clouding her peace. It felt like everything she had worked for, the quiet triumph of taking control of her life, was being undone with every passing day. The pressure was building. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. When her life had fallen apart, it had been a quiet and painful process. No one to witness it except herself. But now, as her success grew, so did the scrutiny. Her family didn't see the struggle behind her decisions, only the reward. They didn't understand that this wasn't about wealth. It was about her reclaiming something they had never truly valued. Helen sat across from Michael in his office, trying to calm the rising tide of panic she felt. The legal battle was real now, and though Michael reassured her that she was entitled to keep the money, the stress was beginning to take a toll. "You're in a good position," Michael said, leaning forward, his voice calm and firm. "They have no legal grounds to demand repayment. It's your money, But you need to be prepared for the long haul. They won't give up easily. Helen nodded, though a sense of dread was settling over her. She had expected resistance, but the emotional cost was far greater than she had imagined. Her family wasn't just fighting for money, they were fighting for something else, something deeper. It was as if her success had become a betrayal, something they couldn't comprehend. "I can handle it," Helen said, though the words tasted hollow. "I will." Michael's eyes softened as he looked at her, but there was a professionalism in his tone. "I'm sure you can, but don't expect this to be resolved quickly, and if they push harder, we'll need to counterattack." Helen left the office with a sense of determination, but also an undercurrent of exhaustion. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about fighting for her right to stand tall, for her right to rebuild in peace. But the price was higher than she had anticipated. Every donation she made now, every deposit that came into her bank account, felt like a weight pressing down on her. It wasn't just the financial pressure, it was the emotional cost of severing ties with the only family she had left. By the time Helen returned home, the storm had intensified. Rain beat against the windows as she stood in the middle of her living room, staring at the check for her next plasma donation. Her life had changed so drastically in such a short time. The money had given her freedom, but it had also taken away the one thing she had fought hardest for: acceptance from her family. She sat down at the kitchen table, running her fingers over the check, the numbers staring back at her. This wasn't just about her. This was about proving to herself that she wasn't the person they thought she was. She wasn't weak. She wasn't a burden. She was strong. And she wasn't going to let them take that away from her. Helen sighed, setting the check down and reaching for her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and paused when she saw Tom's name. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging over her. She didn't want to fight anymore. She didn't want to feel the tension, but at the same time, she couldn't give in. She put the phone down, her decision made. She wasn't going to beg for their understanding. She had fought too long for this, for her peace. If they couldn't see it, then that was their loss. As the rain continued to fall, Helen looked out the window, her reflection staring back at her. She didn't know how this would end, but she knew one thing for sure. Her fight was far from over. And whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The hardest part of her journey wasn't just about the money. It was about her own resilience. And no one could take that from her. Not even family. The storm outside raged as fiercely as the one inside Helen's mind. She sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by legal papers that felt heavier with each passing hour. The lawsuit from Tom and Catherine had escalated, and Helen knew she couldn't let it break her. She had come too far, rebuilt too much, to let them take it all away now. Her lawyer, Michael, had made it clear that they had no legal grounds to take the money from her, but the constant tension was wearing her down. The calls from Tom, the rumors from Catherine, it was all too much. Helen had expected resistance, but not this relentless push from her own flesh and blood. Her heart ached, but the fire in her chest burned brighter. She couldn't back down. This was her fight now, and she would win. As she sipped her tea, her phone buzzed again. It was from Michael. Her hand shook slightly as she answered, her thoughts already swirling with the weight of her battle. "Hello? Helen?" Michael's voice was steady, but there was a sense of urgency to it. "I've got good news. The judge has ruled in your favor. You're legally entitled to keep the plasma earnings. Tom and Catherine can't force you to return anything." Helen let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She could almost feel the weight lifting from her shoulders. But that didn't mean the battle was over. The emotional toll had been far greater than she had anticipated. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice still trembling with the relief that was slowly sinking in. What happens next? Their case is weak. I'll send you the formal papers soon. You just focus on keeping things as calm as you can with your family. I'd suggest keeping your distance from them for now. Let the dust settle. Helen nodded, even though he couldn't see her. It was over for now. The legal fight, at least. But the real battle, the one inside her heart, was far from done. Despite the relief, the tension with her family lingered. She hadn't heard from Tom since the last conversation, and Catherine's silence spoke volumes. Yet, despite the bitterness that still clouded her thoughts, there was a shift in Helen. She had learned something in the fight for her earnings. It wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even about winning. It was about resilience. And so, she made a decision. The thought had been growing in her mind for weeks. Ever since she had seen the power of what she could do with her plasma donations. She could do more than just fight for her own future. She could help others too. That's when the idea for the foundation came to her. A foundation dedicated to helping elderly women who had lost everything, whether it was their financial stability, their homes, or their sense of security. She wasn't going to let others face the isolation and pain she had faced. She knew what it was like to be forgotten, discarded, and now she had the chance to do something about it. Helen sat down at her desk, sketching out ideas for the foundation. A small but meaningful initiative, one that could start in Nashville and grow as far as she could take it. She made calls to local charities, reached out to financial planners who could help manage the funds, and even looked into organizing small community events to raise awareness. She could feel the momentum building inside her, like a powerful wave ready to crest. But her family wasn't far from her thoughts. A few days later, after the storm had passed, Helen stood in her kitchen as the phone rang again. This time, it was Tom. She had expected this call for days. His tone was tentative, the way a child speaks after they've said something wrong and aren't sure if they've been forgiven. "Mom?" His voice softened. I've been thinking." Helen braced herself, wondering if this was finally the moment for reconciliation. "I'm sorry," he continued, "for everything. I shouldn't have demanded the money back. I guess I didn't understand what you were going through, what you had to do to get where you are. I was angry. But I see it now. You did this on your own, and you're right. You earned it." Helen's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and lingering sadness. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing him admit he was wrong, hearing the vulnerability in his voice, it shook her. "I don't need an apology, Tom," Helen replied softly. "I just needed you to see me, to understand why I had to do it this way." Tom was quiet for a moment before he responded, his voice genuine. "I do now. I'll support you in whatever you need." It wasn't the grand reconciliation she had once hoped for, but it was a step, a crack in the wall that had kept them apart. A few weeks later, Helen stood in front of a small crowd at a community center, the first official event for her new foundation. She had been working tirelessly in the background, organizing fundraisers, setting up partnerships with local businesses, and finally, making her vision a reality. The room was filled with elderly women, some who had experienced loss, others who had faced financial ruin, and some who had simply come to find a sense of community. Helen looked at them, all of them, and felt a surge of pride. This was why she had fought so hard. This was the real victory. She stepped up to the microphone, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no fear now, only purpose. "Thank you all for being here today," Helen began, her voice steady and strong. "I started this foundation not because I wanted to be remembered, but because I want to make sure that no woman, no one, feels forgotten again." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. She had built something. She had rebuilt her life on her own terms. And now she was using that strength to give others the chance to rebuild theirs. As Helen spoke, she noticed Tom and Catherine standing at the back of the room, their presence quiet but unmistakable. They hadn't come forward yet, but Helen could feel their eyes on her. Maybe they didn't fully understand everything. Maybe they still had doubts. But they were here. And that was enough. For the first time in a long while, Helen felt truly empowered. She hadn't just survived. She had thrived. And now, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for others, too. She looked out at the faces in the room, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The storm had passed, and in its wake, Helen had weathered not just the storm, but everything else life had thrown at her. And she had come out stronger for it. Helen stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, staring at the woman who looked back at her. The woman in the reflection was strong, stronger than the woman who had walked into this apartment just a year ago. Her hair, though still graying at the edges, had a sheen to it, and her posture was straighter, more confident. She was dressed in a simple navy blue dress, one that she had purchased with the kind of money that, not too long ago, had felt out of reach. The journey had been hard, filled with pain and moments of self-doubt. But now, standing there, she felt a quiet pride she had never allowed herself to feel before. She had made it. She had built a life I can live on my own terms, she thought, smiling to herself. Her phone buzzed from the nightstand. She picked it up without thinking, only to see a message from Lily. "Congrats on the milestone. You're amazing, Helen. I'm so proud of you. Let's celebrate tonight." Helen's heart warmed. Lily had been with her every step of the way, the one person who had truly supported her, understood her, and never judged. Their bond had been built on mutual respect and admiration, and tonight they would celebrate. But there would be no grand gestures, no family present, no Tom, no Catherine. In the months since the Foundation's first event, Tom and Catherine had kept their distance. Despite Helen's growing success and her attempt at reaching out, they refused to acknowledge her progress. They ignored her efforts, her independence, and worst of all, her choice to build something new on her own terms. The family, once the central force in her life, had quietly faded into the background, leaving her to stand alone in the light she had fought so hard to claim. But as the weeks turned into months, Helen began to realize that her relationship with them, if it could still be called that, had changed beyond repair. They had made their judgment. They had chosen to reject her autonomy, her choices. And so, she had stopped trying to make them understand. They hadn't been there for her when she needed them most, and now they were absent as she achieved the very things they had always thought impossible for her. The day Helen rang the bell at the Plasma Center, marking yet another milestone in her personal success, it felt like a quiet triumph. It wasn't just the money, though the regular donations had allowed her to comfortably retire early. It was the feeling that she had control over her own life. The money she had earned wasn't just about survival. It was about security. It was about freedom. Helen had been donating plasma regularly, and as each donation brought in more funds, she had been able to invest wisely. Her returns had exceeded her expectations, allowing her to stop relying on family support entirely. No more calls from Tom asking for help, no more pity-laden offers from Catherine. She was free, and for the first time, she felt truly at peace with that freedom. But the celebration wasn't a family affair. It wasn't a scene of reconciliation with Tom and Catherine. It was just her and Lily, sharing a quiet evening at a cozy local cafe, clinking glasses in celebration of everything Helen had accomplished. Helen looked around the table at her friend, a woman who had never wavered in her support, who had quietly cheered her on from the sidelines, and felt a deep gratitude. "You've come so far, Helen," Lily said, her voice warm, eyes twinkling with pride. This is just the beginning. Helen smiled, nodding, but a part of her knew that tonight wasn't just about the money. It was about something more, something deeper. It was about knowing without a shadow of a doubt that she had made this happen. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't someone to be saved. She was someone who had fought for herself, rebuilt herself, and now she was choosing her own future. Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the streets of Nashville had quieted, Helen sat in front of her desk. The paperwork in front of her felt like the last piece of the puzzle. She had never been one for grand gestures, but tonight, she knew it was time to make a decision. She had been toying with the idea for a while, revising her will, finalizing her legacy, cutting the last ties to the family that had once been the center of her world. With steady hands, she began to write. She updated the will, leaving the bulk of her assets to the foundation she had created for women like herself. Women who had lost everything and were trying to find a way back. She didn't want her money to go to those who had rejected her. And so, she named Lily as the sole beneficiary of her estate. It wasn't about vengeance, but it was about honoring the relationships that had mattered, the ones built on respect and mutual care. As she signed the last page, Helen felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't a decision made out of bitterness, but out of clarity. She had built a life on her own terms, and her legacy, what she left behind, would reflect that. The next day, Helen went to the plasma center, the familiar machines beeping softly as she sat down to donate once again. This time, it wasn't about the money. This time, it was about continuing the journey, about keeping the momentum going. She knew there would be more challenges ahead. There always were. But for now, she could enjoy the sense of purpose that filled her. As the nurse finished the donation and the machine hummed to a close, Helen stood up and walked to the door. She was no longer the woman who had stepped into this center months ago, unsure of what her future held. She was stronger now, not just financially, but emotionally. She had claimed her independence and fought for the right to build her life on her terms. And nothing, not even family, could take that away. As she stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, the weight of the past seemed lighter. She had weathered the storm, and now it was time for her to step into the light, knowing that the future, her future, was hers to shape. Helen hadn't expected Catherine to go this far, but as the envelope slid across the desk in front of her, she felt a strange mixture of disbelief and resignation. It wasn't a surprise. It was more like the final, bitter confirmation of the rift that had already formed between them. The thick, official-looking letter was from Catherine's lawyer, and it didn't take long for Helen to understand its contents. A cease and desist. Catherine was accusing her of slandering the family name by flaunting her success. The very same success Helen had fought for, clawed her way toward, and earned on her own terms. The letter demanded that Helen stop speaking about her newfound wealth, cease any public references to her financial independence, and, more audaciously, return what Catherine deemed rightfully theirs. Helen felt a chill spread through her chest as she read the legal jargon. Slandering the family name? It was laughable, absurd. She hadn't said anything about her family other than the truth. She hadn't flaunted anything. She had simply stood tall and, in doing so, had unwittingly cast a shadow on their own narrow, judgmental view of her. She could feel the heat of anger rising in her chest, but she steadied herself. She wasn't going to let them win this battle. Not this time. Without hesitation, Helen reached for her phone and dialed Michael's number. She didn't need to explain it to him. He knew. He had been with her through all of this, and she trusted him more than anyone. "Michael," she said, her voice tight with control, "I've got a cease and desist letter from Catherine. She's accusing me of slandering our family name and demanding I return the money." Don't worry, Michael replied immediately, his tone calm and reassuring. They're grasping at straws. I'll handle it. You don't need to lift a finger. The next day, Helen sat at her kitchen table watching the rain pour outside. She had given Michael the green light to handle the legal aspects, but she wasn't content to let this attack slide quietly into the background. If Catherine wanted to play dirty, then Helen would show her just how loud the truth could be. With a steady hand, she opened her laptop and drafted a post for social media. She knew that what she was about to do could have consequences, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't hide anymore. She had fought too hard to let someone else define her narrative. It was time for the world to hear her side. As she typed, her thoughts were clear. She wasn't doing this out of vengeance. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was simply stating the truth, her truth. She had built her life again, from the ashes of financial ruin, from the judgment of her family, and now she was free. And she wasn't going to let anyone steal that from her. When she hit post, it was like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Her words, honest and raw, echoed in the silence of the apartment. She shared the cease and desist letter, showing the world exactly what she was up against. She didn't hide behind apologies. She didn't sugarcoat it. She just let people see what she had endured and what she had achieved despite it. The response came faster than she expected. Within hours, Helen's post had gone viral. She was flooded with messages of support, people from all over the world, women especially, who had been through their own battles with family, with estrangement, with betrayal. Hundreds of comments flooded in, sharing stories of abuse, neglect, and rejection by those they once trusted. Every message was a reminder that she wasn't alone. In the days that followed, Helen found herself connecting with other women who had experienced family betrayal. Women who had fought for their own financial independence, their dignity, and their sense of self-worth. Helen felt her heart swell with the realization that her journey wasn't just hers anymore. It was part of a larger shared experience, a story of survival and triumph. But not everyone was supportive. Catherine, unable to control the narrative any longer, erupted in anger. Helen's phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls from her, all of them increasingly hostile. "You're ruining everything, Helen. This is a disgrace." But Helen had no intention of responding. She wasn't going to play the victim anymore. She had told her truth, and it was resonating with people. That was what mattered. The next bombshell came a week later. Helen had just returned from another plasma donation, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment, when she received a call from Michael. He sounded a bit more upbeat than usual, and as soon as he spoke, she understood why. "Catherine's been fired from her job," he said. "She's been let go from her position at the event planning company. Seems there were some ethics violations they couldn't ignore." Helen's heart skipped. She hadn't wished for this, but it felt almost like poetic justice. The very woman who had tried to tear her down was now facing the consequences of her own actions. Helen didn't feel elation. She didn't feel triumphant. But she did feel a quiet satisfaction. Maybe this was what needed to happen for her to learn. It was a hard lesson, one Helen had learned long ago. You couldn't control how others treated you, but you could control how you responded. She had chosen to rise, to live her life on her own terms, and that was a choice no one could take away from her. As the days passed, Helen's resolve only grew stronger. She didn't need validation from anyone, least of all her family. She had found her peace, her purpose, and the support of people who understood her. It was more than she had ever thought possible. And then, as she walked through her front door one evening, she saw a letter resting on the doormat. It was from Catherine's lawyer. Another threat? Another demand? But this time, Helen wasn't afraid. She wasn't even angry. She had weathered the storm, and now, She was standing tall in the sunlight. As she opened the letter, the final words from her family echoed in her mind, but they didn't sting anymore. She had built something far greater than anything they had ever offered her. Her future was hers. And no one, not even family, could take that from her. The sun was setting as Helen sat at her desk, her hands steady as she signed the final version of her legacy plan. She had spent the last few months carefully crafting it, each detail reflecting her journey of rebuilding, of reclaiming the life she had almost lost. This plan wasn't just about money. It was about giving others the opportunity to rebuild as she had. Scholarships for women who, like her, had been pushed to the margins of their families and society, who had lost everything but were determined to rise again. She thought of all the women she had met through her foundation, all the stories of strength and perseverance. This was her legacy, the one that would outlast her, the one that would carry on her fight for independence and dignity. It wasn't just about herself anymore. This was about empowering others to find their voice and their strength, to rebuild from the inside. Her pen hovered over the last section of the document, the portion outlining the scholarships. As she signed her name, a sense of peace settled over her. This was it. This was the future she had worked so hard for. The one that no one, not even Catherine or Tom, could take from her. Weeks passed, and the impact of Helen's journey only grew. Her memoir, Rebuilt from the Inside, had become a sensation. After a quiet but powerful release, the book had gone into its second print, and the response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life were reaching out to her, telling her their stories, thanking her for sharing hers. Helen's words, raw and honest, had resonated with so many who had faced similar struggles, women who had been overlooked, discarded, or betrayed. The message was clear. People wanted to hear the truth. They wanted to hear from someone who had survived, not by accepting defeat, but by fighting for a better life. The book wasn't just a success. It was a movement. But as Helen's star continued to rise, Catherine's began to falter. Helen had known that Catherine wouldn't take kindly to being exposed, but the fallout had been swift and severe. The social media posts, once full of praise and adoration, now slowly turned against her. People who had once been her supporters began to question her ethics. It didn't take long for the stories of her treatment of Helen to come to light, and soon, Catherine's professional reputation began to crumble. Helen saw the headlines from her phone, her stomach tightening as she read about Catherine's fall from grace. The event planning business that had once been her pride and joy now faced criticism and scrutiny. The same business that had profited off the very women Helen was now helping was suddenly facing allegations of unethical practices. People began to see Catherine for what she was, someone who had used her position of privilege to manipulate and control, while casting aside the people who mattered most. Helen felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction. She had long ago realized that her success wasn't about revenge, but about moving forward. Catherine had chosen her path, and now she was facing the consequences of her actions. But Helen wasn't there to see it. She had already moved on. One morning, as Helen sipped her coffee, she received a message from Tom. Her heart skipped. It had been weeks since they had spoken. Months, really. He hadn't tried to reach out after the legal battle, and their fractured relationship had only grown colder. But now, this. Mom, I've been thinking about everything. I'm sorry. I should have supported you. I was wrong. Can you forgive me? Helen stared at the words, her thumb hovering over her phone. She hadn't expected this. In a way, she didn't even know how to respond. For so long, she had wanted him to understand, to see the strength it had taken for her to get here. She had hoped, maybe naively, that one day they could rebuild their relationship. But now, as she read his message, something inside her hardened. "It's too late," she typed, and pressed send before she could change her mind. She didn't owe him forgiveness. Not now. Not after everything. She had fought for her peace, for her independence, and she wasn't about to let anyone, family or not, take that from her. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. It was from Lily, and when Helen opened it, a broad smile spread across her face. Lily had been accepted into a prestigious arts program, a dream Helen had supported since the very beginning. In the letter, Lily thanked her for the scholarship she had helped fund and for being a guiding light in her life. Lily's words were full of gratitude and hope, and Helen couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Lily had worked hard, but it was Helen's guidance, her belief in her, that had made this possible. It wasn't just a scholarship, it was a promise. A promise that no one, not even the people who had torn her down, would stop her from helping others rise. As Helen closed the letter, she felt a deep sense of contentment settle in her chest. This was what it was all about. This was the legacy she had built. Not just the wealth, not just the book, but the impact she had on others. For the first time, she felt whole. The past was behind her. The future was bright. And in this moment, she knew without a doubt, she had made the right choice. But just as the shadows of her past began to fade, there was one last twist. A message blinked on her screen. A new notification from her lawyer. It was a headline. Catherine, in a last-ditch attempt to salvage her reputation, had filed for an appeal. The legal fight wasn't over. Helen stared at the screen, the weight of the news sinking in. She hadn't expected it to be this easy. But just as quickly as the frustration flared up, Helen felt a calm wash over her. She had weathered storms before, and she was stronger now. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. Her legacy was intact, and no one, not even Catherine or Tom, could take that from her. This was her fight, and she would continue to win it. Helen heard the knock long before she reached the door. It wasn't loud or frantic. It wasn't the kind of knock that demanded attention. It was soft, uncertain, almost fragile. A knock from someone who wasn't sure they were welcome. For a moment, Helen stood still in the hallway, her hand hovering inches from the doorknob. She knew who it was. She didn't need to look through the peephole, didn't need to guess. She felt it in her chest. A quiet tightening, not pain exactly, but something old and familiar resurfacing. She opened the door. Tom stood there with his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his shoulders hunched as if he were bracing for a blow. His eyes were red, his expression tense. He looked older, smaller, and for the first time in her life, Helen saw her son not as the man she had raised, but as someone lost, someone carrying the weight of choices he finally understood. "Mom," he said, voice cracking just slightly. "Can I come in?" Helen stepped aside, wordless, and let him enter. Tom walked into the living room slowly, his gaze drifting over the space, the framed photographs of her foundation events, the neatly stacked drafts of her memoir's third print edition, the warmth of a life she had built without him, the quiet pride of it, the independence. He turned toward her, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry," he said, barely above a whisper. "For everything. I know I said that before, but I didn't get it then. Not really. I get it now." Helen folded her arms, not out of defensiveness, but out of a practiced restraint. She waited. Tom exhaled shakily. "I know I abandoned you. I know I sided with Catherine when I shouldn't have. I know I treated you like a burden when you were drowning. And then when you got back on your feet, when you did better than any of us, I felt ashamed. I let Catherine get into my head and I didn't stand up for you. I should have. I should have been there." He rubbed at his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. I really am." Helen didn't move. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't soften. She let the silence fill the room. stretching thin and taut between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, calm enough to sting. "You had your chance, Tom." Tom's breath hitched, his jaw trembled. I know I blew it, but I've learned. I swear I have. I don't want things to be like this. Just, just give me one more chance. One." Helen stepped past him and sat down in her armchair, the one Lily surprised her with when the foundation hit its first major milestone. It was soft, sturdy, and warm, like everything Lily touched. She gestured toward the opposite chair. "Sit." Tom obeyed immediately, desperate, hopeful in a way that twisted something in her, but not enough to change anything. She studied him for a long moment, the man who had turned his back on her when she was at her lowest, the man who sided with a woman who saw Helen's hardship as an embarrassment, the man who now claimed he had changed only after the world had seen Helen rise without them. She inhaled slowly. "You want another chance," she said, "but you didn't give me one." Tom's mouth parted, but she raised a hand to stop him. "When I needed you, when I was scared, broke, alone, you didn't show up. You let Catherine decide who I was to you, and you let her voice drown out mine." Tom bowed his head. Shame radiated from him like heat. Helen leaned forward, her voice soft but solid as stone. "I don't need you anymore, Tom. I've built something far more meaningful than family ties." Tom looked up sharply, eyes wet. "Mom, please." "No." Her voice didn't waver. "Not anymore." Tom stared at her, breath shuddering, as realization washed over him. A realization that cut deeper than anger ever could. This wasn't punishment. This was closure. He stood slowly, his movements stiff, as though every part of him hurt. He looked at her one last time, really looked, and in his eyes, Helen saw no anger, no defensiveness, just smallness, defeated smallness. "Goodbye, Mom," he whispered, voice breaking. Helen didn't stand, didn't reach for him, didn't try to soften the blow. She nodded once. Tom opened the door, hesitated, then stepped out, closing it behind him with a soft click that echoed through the house like the final line of a chapter. Helen didn't cry. Instead, she leaned back into her chair, letting a deep exhale ease out of her chest. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, cleansing, full. And then, just as she closed her eyes, her phone buzzed on the side table. A message from Michael. "Helen, call me when you can. Something's happened." She opened her eyes. The next storm was already forming. Helen sat at her kitchen table, the soft light of the afternoon casting long shadows across the room. She had been writing for hours, typing with a sense of purpose, a steady rhythm that matched the quiet peace she felt settling into her life. The foundation was thriving, her memoir was well received, and she had finally found the space to start thinking about the future. But now, with a sigh, she picked up her pen and signed the final draft of her obituary. It was a surreal moment. Not the obituary of someone about to pass, but rather one that would carry the essence of who she was after she was gone, a legacy she would leave behind. The first line of her obituary was simple. Helen Brooks, mother, writer, and advocate for women's independence, passed away peacefully at the age of 82. But it was what followed that marked her true legacy. Helen is survived only by her beloved granddaughter, Lily, who has been a beacon of light and love in her life. In place of a traditional funeral service, Helen requests that her estate be donated to charities focused on helping women who have experienced family estrangement and financial hardship. Helen felt the weight of the decision sink in. She had chosen to sever the final ties to her family. Tom had apologized, but it was too late. Catherine had done more than enough to prove how far she was willing to go to protect her image. This was the final step. It was the act of reclaiming not just her life, but her legacy, and she had decided to pass it on in a way that would help other women rebuild theirs. She smiled as she read the last part of the obituary again. Helen also established a writing grant for women who have endured similar experiences to help them find their voice, their healing, and their freedom. Helen folded the paper and set it aside. She had already planned for this, already written the check for the first round of scholarships to fund the grant. It felt like the right thing to do. She wasn't just donating money, she was giving others the chance to be heard. The chance to rewrite their own stories. A few weeks later, Helen had moved into a smaller, sunnier home on the edge of Nashville. It was a modest space, but it felt right. The air was different here, brighter, warmer, and filled with the possibility of new beginnings. This house was not a home built out of obligation or expectations. It was a sanctuary, a place for her to grow, to write, and to help others grow. She spent her mornings in the light-filled living room, sipping coffee as she looked out the window at the garden she had already started to tend. She thought about the women who had written to her, the ones who had shared their own stories of family betrayal and personal reinvention. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was theirs too. She had become part of something much larger than herself, and she couldn't wait to see how much further it could go. Helen smiled as she ran her fingers over the paper she had just finished. A letter to Lily, her granddaughter. It was simple but heartfelt, a message of pride and love for the woman Lily had become. You broke the cycle, my dear. I am proud of you more than words can say. Your courage, your strength, these are the things that matter. You are my legacy. Helen felt a lump in her throat as she folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, addressed to Lily. She would send it tomorrow. For now, she took a deep breath and pushed the thought of the past away. She had done what she needed to do. 2 months later, Helen found herself standing at the front of a room filled with women at a survivor's brunch. The atmosphere was warm, inviting, full of the quiet hum of women gathering to share their experiences. It was a place for healing, for connection. Helen had been invited to speak about her journey. She wasn't sure what to expect. Public speaking had never been something she enjoyed, but this was different. This was a space where the truth mattered. And her truth, her story, was one that could help others find their way. She walked to the podium, looking out over the faces of the women in the audience. Some were older, some younger, but all had the same look of quiet strength in their eyes. They were here because they had been broken by family, but they were here because they had also been rebuilt. Helen took a deep breath and began to speak. I'm here today, not because I have all the answers, she started, her voice steady, but because I know what it's like to lose everything and still rise again. She paused, looking out over the room. She could see the understanding in their eyes, the recognition. They had all been there. When my own family rejected me, I thought I would never be able to rebuild, she continued. But I did, and I did it on my own terms. It wasn't easy. It never is. But today, I stand here, a woman who has rebuilt herself, and I want you all to know that you can do the same. There was silence for a moment, before a woman from the back of the room stood up, tears in her eyes. She walked toward Helen slowly, her voice breaking as she spoke. My daughter did the same to me, she said, her words shaking. She left me when I needed her the most. I thought I would never find my way again. But hearing your story, it's like a light has been switched on. You've inspired me. Helen felt her heart swell with emotion, the weight of the moment settling over her. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about them. It was about all the women who had been pushed aside, who had been told they weren't good enough, who had been left to fend for themselves. But now they had a chance to rebuild, just like she had. The woman in front of her wiped away her tears and gave Helen a soft smile. Helen returned it, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. She had rebuilt her life, not for her family, but for herself. And in doing so, she had built something far more lasting than family ties. She had built a community, a family of her own making, a legacy that would live on long after she was gone, and that, she realized, was the greatest gift she could give. Helen walked slowly through the cancer center, the quiet hum of the machines and the soft shuffle of nurses' feet, the only sounds that filled the otherwise peaceful space. She had visited before, but this time it felt different. This time she was no longer just a donor, no longer just someone who had given plasma. She was part of something larger, something that had changed lives. Her footsteps echoed softly on the polished floors as she made her way toward the small plaque near the entrance. She had asked for it to be simple, understated, yet there it was. Her name, engraved in gold, along with a phrase that made her heart swell every time she read it. For those who survived spite. The words held weight for Helen, each one carrying years of struggle, of rejection, of the moments where she thought she might break under the pressure. And yet, she had survived. And in doing so, she had helped others do the same. She placed a hand on the plaque, her fingers lingering over the cold metal, a soft smile playing at her lips. This was more than just the money she had donated. It was more than the plasma donations or the check that had funded this place. It was a symbol of everything she had worked for, the legacy she had built. A legacy that wasn't about wealth or fame, but about changing lives, about giving back. She turned away from the plaque and made her way to the nearby office where a group of doctors and researchers were gathered around a table. One of the doctors caught her eye and smiled warmly, standing to greet her. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "We wanted to thank you again. Your generosity has made an incredible difference in the lives of so many patients here. Without your donations, we wouldn't have been able to make the strides we have in our research." Helen smiled, nodding, but the truth was that the thanks didn't feel necessary. She had given, not because she wanted praise, but because she knew the work being done here was important. It was about healing. It was about hope. "You're very welcome," Helen replied, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of her journey. "I'm just glad I could help." Later that afternoon, after a quiet reflection in the center, Helen returned to her home. She had spent so much of her life focused on surviving, on rebuilding, that it was easy to forget how far she had come. Her life was no longer a battle for survival. It was a celebration of what she had built. As she walked in, she heard the familiar sound of a knock at her door. A moment later, it opened, and Lily entered, her arms laden with a heavy portfolio. "Grandma!" Lily's voice rang out, full of excitement. "I've got something to show you." Helen smiled, her heart swelling as she watched Lily set the portfolio down on the table. Lily, her granddaughter, had been the one bright spot in the years of darkness. She had always been Helen's reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was light. And now, to see Lily standing here, so full of promise, it was almost too much to bear. Lily flipped open the portfolio, revealing the vibrant, expressive pieces of art she had created, pieces that told stories of pain, of joy, of resilience. Helen couldn't help but beam with pride as she examined each one, every brushstroke a reflection of the woman Lily had become. "You're amazing, Lily," Helen said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You've always had this light inside of you." Lily smiled, a soft blush coloring her cheeks. "I learned from the best," she said, her eyes shining. Helen felt a lump rise in her throat. She had rebuilt her life, and in doing so, she had rebuilt something far greater than herself. She had given Lily the chance to flourish, to create, to live her life without the burdens of family rejection weighing her down. And Lily had taken that chance and run with it. That night, as the house settled into quiet, Helen sat at her desk, a journal in front of her. She had written in it for years, recording the moments of triumph, the moments of despair. But tonight, her thoughts were different. She opened the journal to a blank page and began to write a letter to Lily. "You broke the cycle, my dear. I am proud of you more than words can say. Your courage, your strength. These are the things that matter. You are my legacy." As she wrote, Helen couldn't help but think of the future she had carefully crafted, not just for herself, but for Lily and the women she had helped along the way. She had become a part of something much larger than herself, a force for change, a beacon of hope. Later that evening, as Helen sat with Gina, her lawyer, in the kitchen, they toasted to the completion of the final legacy binder. Everything was in order. Her will, the foundation's future, the writing grant for women, and the plans for her estate to be donated to those in need. Gina raised her glass. "To a new chapter," she said, her smile warm and knowing. Helen clinked her glass with Gina's, her heart swelling with contentment. The past had been painful, but it had brought her to this moment, and now she could finally let go. The next morning, as Helen walked through the cancer center once more, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of fulfillment. The center's administrators had thanked her again for her generous contributions, but it was more than that. It was the knowledge that she had made a difference, her difference. As she passed the plaque, the words still shining in the soft light, Helen couldn't help but smile. It wasn't about family, it was about the legacy she had built. The journey had been long and filled with hardship, but Helen had found her peace, and she knew it was the most valuable gift she could ever give. And with that, she stepped forward into the next chapter, knowing that the light she had worked so hard to cultivate would continue to shine brightly, not just for her, but for others, for years to come. Helen sat in the crowd at Lily's college orientation, her heart swelling with pride. The campus was alive with energy, the air buzzing with the excitement of new beginnings. Fresh faces surrounded her, but Helen's gaze was fixed firmly on the stage. Lily was up there, beaming with confidence, her nerves hidden behind a bright smile. It had been a whirlwind to get here, but there she was, her granddaughter, ready to begin her next chapter. The light that had guided Helen through her darkest days now shone brighter than ever in Lily. Beside Helen sat Natalie, her oncology nurse, now a lifelong friend. The bond they'd formed during Helen's cancer treatment had turned into something unbreakable. They'd supported each other through more than they could count, and now, here they were, together in this new chapter. Natalie smiled at Helen, her eyes soft with understanding. "She's amazing," Natalie said, her voice full of quiet awe. "You did a good job." "Helen?" Helen didn't respond immediately. She was too wrapped up in the moment, watching Lily. There had been a time when Helen thought she would never see this day, the day Lily stepped into a future where family rejection no longer weighed her down. Now, here they were. Helen had made it happen. The speaker on stage cleared their throat, and the crowd grew silent. They began to read from a list of motivational quotes, but one caught Helen's attention. The speaker's voice echoed through the amphitheater. "Sometimes your bloodline ends with betrayal, but your legacy begins with love." Helen's chest tightened, a small gasp escaping her lips as the words resonated deep within her. She looked at Natalie, who gave her a knowing look. "That's your quote, isn't it?" Natalie said quietly, a proud smile playing at her lips. Helen nodded, feeling a wave of peace wash over her. It was her words, her journey, one that had come full circle. Her legacy was no longer tied to the people who had cast her aside. It was tied to the work she had done, the lives she had touched, and the love she had built from nothing. Later that day, after the orientation had ended, Helen walked home under a soft golden sunset. The warm glow of the porch lights greeted her as she approached her front door. It was a small, modest home, but it was hers. The sanctuary she had built. The place she had poured her energy into, creating a life of peace, purpose, and independence. As she stepped inside, she felt the familiar stillness of her home settle around her like a blanket. She set the final legal folder down on the kitchen table, the last of the official paperwork that would ensure her estate went to the causes she believed in. She had chosen to leave behind a legacy that would help other women reclaim their lives, just as she had. It wasn't about wealth or material things. It was about giving others the chance to rebuild from their own hardships. She poured herself a cup of tea, the warm liquid soothing her as she took a seat by the window, looking out at the world she had made her own. Helen opened her journal, the pages filled with years of memories, of pain, of joy, of triumphs big and small. She turned to the last entry, the one she had written just that morning. I survived twice. She smiled as she read the words, the weight of them sinking in. She had fought for everything she had, and now, for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Her life was hers, no longer defined by the cruelty of family betrayal, but by her resilience and the love she had built along the way. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes healing didn't come from fixing what was broken, but from choosing to move forward. The quiet of the evening settled in, and Helen felt a sense of closure. She had done what she set out to do. She had rebuilt her life, and she had rebuilt it on her own terms. She wasn't the woman who had been abandoned. She was the woman who had found her way back. Her phone buzzed softly on the table, and she picked it up without thinking. It was a message from Lily, her voice filled with excitement. Grandma, I made it to the first day of class. I couldn't have done this without you. Helen smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she typed back, her heart full. You're my legacy, Lily, not them. Later that night, as she sat on her porch, watching the stars twinkle above, Helen felt a deep sense of contentment. The past was behind her, the weight of betrayal lifting from her shoulders. Her future was clear now, and it was one of purpose and peace. She had made her own family, a family of choice, not obligation. She had created something that no one could take from her. As the gentle breeze stirred the leaves in the trees, Helen closed her eyes, breathing in the cool air. She had fought for this peace, and she had earned it. When she was diagnosed with cancer, her daughter-in-law laughed in front of her son. So she cut them out of her life, and healed in peace they would never touch. Her journey had been long, and it had been hard, but it had also been hers, and in the end, that was all that mattered.